16, and this is what he did
Yeah.
on the way to,
That's so cool.
in, going into the Navy.
That's
or going
really
to
cool.
the,
This was just before
Marines.
World War II.
Yeah, World War II. And
Okay.
it was really very interesting. So,
All right, you ready?
okay, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, we're gonna be on tape?
Yeah.
You're on video now.
All right, tell me when.
Okay.
Go.
Okay, all right, Mom, we'll
Yes.
start with you. Can you state your full name, your date of birth, where you are in your family as far as your siblings, and we'll start with that.
Okay, my name is Sharon Ann Sweeney Hawk. I was born September 3rd, 1940, and I was the oldest daughter. I have a sister, Gail, 3 years younger, 2 years younger, or something like that. And then a brother, Tim, who was maybe 3 years younger than that.
5 years younger.
Well, 5 years younger than me.
Right.
Okay.
And tell me about your parents. Who were they?
My dad was Thomas James Sweeney, and he was he grew up in Austin. My mom did too, they both grew up in Austin. And, he was
On
born in
Austin?
Austin,
Austin,
part of
part
of
Chicago.
Chicago.
That
In
was
Chicago.
right next to Oak Park, yeah. And, my mom lived on Parkside, and my dad lived on Washington Boulevard, I think, I'm not sure. And he was a milkman, and he also sold, housing or
Remodeling.
improvements, remodeling, part-time, but didn't do too well at that.
Okay. What is your earliest recollection of your grandparents? Tell me about your grandparents.
Well, I can tell you what Christmas was like with my grandparents.
Yeah, what's that?
The Snyders, my mother was the oldest and she had 5 brothers, and they all had kids. And we'd go to their house on Parkside Avenue in Austin, and they would all, and I was the oldest, so they would take us out into the back porch when Santa Claus came, and we would hear bells, and they would make, the reindeers would stomp out in the snow in the back, and it was really, even though I, was older, I went along with it. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. And then that was Christmas Eve always. Christmas Day, we would go to the Sweeneys. Sweeneys were a little different. My grandmother had nothing but blue lights on the tree. Our Lady's blue. She was very religious Catholic. And it was the most depressing place to go. It was just the 3 of us. And so we'd always bring our books, but there was never a light light enough in the house to actually read by. I mean, it was really, then we were the only 3 kids. My uncles didn't have kids. So that was just something we went through. So I understand when kids come to grandparents and they're not having a great time. I understand that, I can remember that. Okay,
Well, what do you remember about your childhood as far as Chicago and growing up? Tell me about how Chicago was set up in the 40s and the 50s, and what do you remember about that?
I lived for the first 5 years of my life on Parkside, near Diversey. Very nice neighborhood. Wonderful kids on the street and all that. And then when I was just about to start school, we moved to Oak Park. And we lived at 802 North Taylor, which is a nice little bungalow in there. And that was really where I grew up. And what was the rest of your question?
What do you remember about Chicago and how it was?
Well, as an older kid, I used to get on the Austin. First of all, you didn't worry about traveling. Kids didn't worry about going by themselves. So we would get on my friends and I would get on the Austin Avenue bus and we'd go to the Lake Street L, and we'd take the Lake Street L into Chicago, and we'd get off at Marshall Fields. And we'd just spend the whole day in Marshall Fields, or maybe we'd go to Carson's, which was the next stop. I don't think our feet ever touched the ground. We just had a wonderful time wandering around. We weren't afraid of Chicago.
Did they have suburbs in Chicago?
We lived in
Outside?
a suburb.
You were
We lived in Oak Park.
Where did it end?
Oh, I have no idea. I remember when we drove to Wheaton, I felt like we were going to the end of the earth. Because there was Oak Park, River Forest, Maywood, Elmwood Park, and then who knew what was beyond that. So that was as far as as I really did. You know, as a kid, we would go out, it was out North Avenue, that we would go to like at Christmas. Did you go with your family? There was something out there that was kind of a Christmassy thing.
Was it Olson's at all?
Olson's, oh, that wasn't downtown, Olson's,
No,
right?
Olson's is one of these out was.
But there was a waterfall at Olson's, that was in Chicago. Anyway, that was kind of a big deal. And Olson's Rock Company had a waterfall, and it was all lit up, and it was had Christmas trees, and that was kind of a once a year thing, we'd go there. What else did we do for Christmas? And we had a good time.
How did you meet your husband?
It was the last day of my junior year of high school. It happened to be a Thursday. And on Monday and Thursday, I worked at the fair store at Oak Park. And on Monday and Thursday, the fair store was open till 9 o'clock. That was the time, that was the only time that they were open. And so I was working there, and there were a lot of Trinity girls who were working there. And about 8:30, a whole bunch of guys walked through. And they said, "There's a party tonight at Chuck King's house."
I wasn't one of them.
And these were all guys who were home from college. They had just come home from college, and they just wanted to be girls. And so they said, at 9 o'clock when the store closed, we're gonna have a bunch of cars lined up outside to take you to a party at Chuck King's house. So, okay, so I called my mom and I said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm going to this party, don't worry, I'm gonna get a ride home." And, anyway, that was where he asked me
I
to
met him,
dance.
her at the party.
Yeah.
We lived 2 blocks away from Chuck King's
Yeah.
house, so.
And he asked me to dance, and he went to the University of Illinois, which is where I thought I might be going. So that was really cool.
Did you start dating right away, or did you kind of?
Yes, we did. Actually, the next night, I met him at another party, and he asked me to go on a picnic to Crystal Lake, Yeah, Crystal Lake State Park.
She had a boyfriend.
And I went, and my friends were very surprised that I was there with him, because where was Dick Cooley, who had been my boyfriend all through my junior year? And that was the last of Dick Cooley.
All right. And then you got married when?
We didn't get married right away.
4 years later.
Yeah,
4 years later. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And how old were you when you got married?
20,
20.
yeah.
Okay.
So
All right.
69.
So and you were down at U of I, right? And you were going to school for a while, and you can explain basically how that all worked out with when you got pregnant with Brian, right?
Well, I went
Before that.
2 years, then, but then we got married and lived down there because your dad was in law school.
Mm-hmm.
And so I worked at the agronomy department, and he went to law school, and he was about to be inducted or whatever for the Vietnam War. So there are a couple ways you stayed out of Vietnam. One was you went to school, and the other was you had children. So first he went to school, and then he had Brian, so he did not have to go to Vietnam, which was incredible. It was just a horrifying time.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything worked out fine.
Right. And then after Dad graduated from law school, where did you go?
We moved to Oak Park first, and he had a job with a firm downtown for a short while. But earlier, the last Christmas before, I think, he had been in a wedding out here in Wheaton. And it was one of his fraternity brothers, Noel Workman, who married Liz Frank, who lived in Wheaton. So Jim was an usher in the wedding, and he met John Woodward. And John Woodward was the leading lawyer in Wheaton. Ratzer Woodward Dyer & Burt was just the top firm for Ratzer Woodward at that time. And so when he was about to met him, and obviously Mr. Woodward was very impressed with your father, as he would be. And anyway, sent him a resume, and
So do you still keep in contact with your old friends from high school and grade school?
Yeah, well, yeah, I went to my 60th high school reunion.
Last
Recently.
fall.
Hmm?
Last fall.
Thanksgiving.
Yeah, recently. Actually, a lot of them I've lost track of completely.
Okay.
Women tend to do that because they change their names, you know, and move away, and so, for a number of years, I kept up with a lot of my high school friends, but, you know, we've kind of, Nancy Parker still lives in town. There are a couple that I see, but not much.
So what are the best memories of your life? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my
Okay.
best friend,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely my
Okay.
best friend,
Right.
and
I know you've traveled all over the world. What are the highlights of your travels?
Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, I would say were, and then of course Mexico, San Miguel de Allende, Mexico is my favorite place, really, to go to year after year after year.
Go ahead.
So, you guys grew up in turbulent times in the 60s from a civil rights perspective, and I know you had some interesting travels down in the South. Can you tell us about that?
Do you remember that?
Sure.
Go ahead, it's your turn.
Summer of 1964. If you remember, there were 3 civil rights workers that went down to recruit black voters, and they disappeared. And I don't know if anybody has seen the movie Mississippi Burning.
You made me watch it with
We
you.
were there
right?
when that happened. What happened was the 3 civil rights workers were missing. And this fellow that married a Wheaton girl was a lieutenant in the Air Force down in Greenville, Mississippi. And he was working as a stringer, which means part-time, for the Delta Democrat Times. The Delta Democrat Times was owned by a guy named Harding Carter. Harding Carter was a Pulitzer Prize winner, and he was disliked by a lot of the people in Mississippi because he advocated that Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, be integrated. James Meredith, who was a black man, tried to get in, and he campaigned for him to be admitted. It was a very famous case, but in any event, when we got down there in the summer of '64, this was 3 months before the Civil Rights Act was passed. Civil Rights Act was passed in October of '64. LBJ was the president. And the Greenville, if you went through Greenville, you would see fountains that said color only on it. You would see movie theaters that said color entrance. You would, the good restaurants in town would not permit black people to be waited on in the restaurants. But in any event, this guy was kind of brave in doing that, but in doing that, everybody in his employment packed guns to work. It was that bad. I mean, you strapped a gun on and you went to work because you were threatened by some of the crackers in town. In any event, we were invited with our friends to go to a dinner party at Harding Carter's house. We pulled up to the front yard of his house, which was an old southern mansion with the big columns like you picture an old southern mansion. And it had an 8-foot iron fence around it. And there were guards walking the grounds of his house with shotguns and dogs. And I said to Noel, Noel, what the hell is going on here? He said, well, you'll see when you pull up to the house. It had a big circular drive. So we were admitted through the gate. We came around the circular drive, and in the area that was encompassed by the circular drive, there were 3 giant wooden crosses that had been burned by the Ku Klux Klan. They were trying to intimidate this guy. We went down to New Orleans from there, and when we got back, they had discovered, the FBI had been all over central Mississippi, and they had finally cracked the case and found these 3 guys, these kids, buried in a levee. and they prosecuted the guys who did it. Believe it or not, it was a sheriff and a deputy sheriff from Neshoba County, the next county over, that killed him. And they were tried in a Mississippi court, state court, and they were exonerated. But Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General, and so he prosecuted them with civil rights, deprivation of civil rights, and they got him, and they convicted him, and they went to jail, but only for 10 years, but it was murder. So that was
more?
one of our stories.
So,
And then you talked about when I was in the back of the VW.
Our
Stopped by the
friend
police.
Bill Workman said when you come down, we were driving a red Volkswagen with foreign plates on it. My parents had bought the car. The deal was they were gonna travel around Germany or Europe in it, and then we would buy it from them when they came back, and which we did. So we still had the German plates on the car, and he said, whatever you do, don't go over the speed limit, because they're looking for civil rights workers. And if you go over the speed limit, they're gonna stop you. So anyway, we crossed the border from Tennessee into Mississippi, and we had a cop car behind us just like that. And Brian was 6 months old at the time, laying down in the back seat. We didn't have car seats then. He followed us for several miles, and then Brian suddenly stood up and looked out the back window. And as soon as this cop saw Brian, who was just 6 months old at the time, he pulled away.
Right.
so Dad, you were, it's kind of weird for us to think about, you were alive during World War II. So you were born in 1938. What do you remember from World War II? I mean, Hitler was alive at the same time and you were alive. Do you remember anything from that time? I mean, what was your recollections? Anything?
Well,
Because I know you were young.
I had just celebrated my third birthday, December 5th of 1941. If you remember, we got in the war when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor.
Right.
That happened on December 7th, 1940, 2 days after my third birthday. And I don't know much about the war. I just remember my parents lived on the south side of Chicago, and I remember that they had a conversation about the fact that they were so relieved that the war was over. So that was 1945. That's the only thing I recollect about it. My dad was too old. He was 39 when I was born. So he was too old for this.
Do you have any recollection of your grandfather?
My father's
Grandpa Milbauer.
father's father, no. He died as well. My father's parents died before I was born.
Okay.
My father was born in Schuyler, Nebraska in 1902. And he and my grandmother divorced, which was a very unusual event at that time. Her name was McIntyre. And on my mother's side, I definitely remember my grandfather. He was a big, tough little German. He was a steam fitter, worked in industrial plants, and he was a big guy. For our family, he was about 6 feet tall. I mean, he was pretty fit. And he lived with us the last 3 or 4 years of his life. My grandmother died. I can't remember when she died, but it was after that he came to live with us, and I don't have any clear recollection of her at all.
His name was Milbauer.
Milbauer was their name, Jack Milbauer and Agnes Milbauer.
So when you were young, you actually spent some time living in Wisconsin. Tell us about that.
Well, my father, fortunately during the Depression, had a job with the FHA, Federal Housing Administration. He had graduated from the University of Illinois and had a degree in finance, and he went to law school at night. He had a good job, so he never suffered during the Depression. He ultimately took a job with a company called B.C. Ziegler, which was at the time, still is, probably the biggest investment banker and mortgage banker in Wisconsin. And they were in West Bend, oddly enough, which is a little town, used to be little, about 20 miles north of Milwaukee. And in any event, we moved up there, and he had to do a lot of traveling, and a mortgage banker, so you know, that's what he did. He arranged financing for institutions, for example, a hospital, a medical clinic, churches, a lot of stuff like that. So he did a lot of traveling. And we were up there for 3 years, but I was in first grade, second grade, and third grade, and then we moved down to Oak Park. And so I started school in fourth grade in Oak Park. We lived in Oak Park until I finished 8th grade. And then I went to St. Catherine of Siena Grammar School. And then we moved to River Forest. That's when I started Fenwick High School.
So, go ahead.
Okay, so a little off track, but so yeah, we were very fortunate enough to grow up with our grandfather, who was we all agree was just like he was the best, wonderful man, and Bernice was also wonderful. I have one picture in my little kid book of me and my grandmother, your mom, and so tell us a little bit about your mom, because that's one thing we've not talked about too much.
Well, I tell you, if you can excuse me for about 5 minutes, I'll go down and I'll get a picture.